Now thinking about feet in a different way on vessels and sculptures, instead of just leaving the bottom of a piece blank and flat so that it can sit on the surface, think of a way to creatively elevate the piece off from the pedestal. One method that you could use is using small, fat little coils. Now, whenever you're trying to replicate something, you want to prepare all the pieces of clay so that you know that you have roughly the same amount of clay and they're about the same size. So sure, you could just stick this on the bottom of your piece in any whatever configuration, but it's not really very inspired. I encourage you to spend some time playing. Play around with some of the techniques that we've talked about, such as pressing. So I could press a pattern, I could press in other ways. And I could even use my hands. But also consider how you can change the clay by pressing and pinching and squeezing. So just squeezing like this makes a much more interesting foot, and then I have to think about how it would attach to the piece. That, of course, could actually be something sculptural, like a lion's paw, if I wanted it to be. I could attach it like this, I could attach it like this. Now, attaching a foot in a manner like this seems interesting, but it's also very precarious. Even if I cut a hole here so that this is inserted, it's just a really small connection point. When you're thinking of a foot, you want to think of something that has a nice, strong attachment. So I could pinch, like I said, squeeze the clay in this direction. Maybe I could squeeze the clay like this. But I encourage you to play around with different things and see what would be interesting. In what ways can you draw some attention to the foot of your piece? Instead of just using coils, you can use discs, flat pieces of clay. Once again, they could just be attached underneath, but that's pretty boring. So I can, again, press something like a tool, but I can also press found objects to make interesting marks in the clay. I have a collection of found objects, and a lot of them are just toys that I find, and making different marks in the clay using something that's found can really give some interesting results as well. Try to think of clever methods for changing the shape of foots to make them more stable. Sometimes things don't work out, and that's just fine. Other things you can do is actually look at the form itself, and instead of adding clay, consider how you could subtract clay and make an interesting foot. So provided that you know the thickness of your clay piece, you could actually cut out areas to create visual interest. But if you do this, try to exaggerate and take a significant amount away instead of just barely cutting or removing, because it won't really make the visual impact. But this is a really interesting way to address really any part of your piece, but the foot in particular, because when people use a vessel form, utilitarian form, touching the bottom of the piece is bound to happen. And so thinking of that opportunity for the user to engage with the piece in a different way is very thoughtful. Besides cutting, you could also consider how you could press or pinch to create some sort of different foot or elevation. Just something like that already makes it interesting. I could go from the inside and push it outward. And then instead of having a flat bottom, I actually have a different place that I could add foots onto. But thinking of your foot, of your sculpture or vessel form in a different way is definitely an interesting method to consider. Think about different solutions. For example, this is a pretty typical tumbler cup, but it has a texture that goes around the entire outer edge of the foot, and this actually serves as a functional area to collect glaze. Additionally, this middle portion of the foot is pressed upward, so that glaze can be applied to this section. A more traditional solution to the foot is the typical foot ring, which of course could be made from a coil or a slab. Just be very cognizant if you choose this route that there is a space, a negative space in the middle of the ring where there are opportunities for interesting visual design. Also think about consistency when making foot rings like this. As opposed to just a chunky, fat, chubby coil, they are opportunities to show elegant design. Other solutions, this is a coil foot, but it's loaded with texture, it's doubled up, and again, there is an opportunity in a negative space for something interesting on the inside of the foot. Foots can also be added and be individual. So this piece also has a dented upward bottom, but then it has little half discs that have been folded and textured and folded and then attached to the outer edge of the piece to slightly elevate it up off from the table. And then there are other ways that are very non-traditional to make a foot. This piece does not actually have a foot that allows it to rest flat on the table. It's just a rounded partial sphere, and the intention is that the object is not to sit flat on the table. Instead, it is to roll and wobble and be very off center, but it won't tip over. When it has fluid, there will be enough weight down at the bottom that it won't tip over. So when you are thinking of your foot, remember it's an opportunity for elevated design as well as an interesting way to engage your viewer.